Okay, welcome back to week 5, American Literature, a genre study of mystery fiction. So, first, let's talk a little bit about the descriptive style comparison of Poe and Doyle's. Now, Edgar Allan Poe uses description in his stories for sure. But Doyle really goes far and away further than Poe in a descriptive style. Poe seems to be kind of a basic, you get a general understanding of your surroundings and circumstances. But Doyle really puts you right in the middle of where you are. You can actually picture in your mind almost every detail: clothing, color, what's there, smell, taste. He goes really into much further depth than Poe. Okay, so when we think about our research paper for our consultation week, this is something you might want to focus in on, is comparing the descriptive styles of these two authors. All right, so let's quickly review our story up to this point. We've got 2 murders in London. Both of the victims are Americans. One of the murders is done by way of poison. Some pills are found at the scene. The other murder is done by a knife wound. There's a word written on the wall of both crime scenes, R-A-C-H-E. The police think it's Rachel in the first time they see it, but seeing it again the second time spelled the same way. Holmes seems to be correct in his assumption that it's a German word. I think it's pronounced Achi, which means revenge. Again, both written in blood on the walls, but not the victim's blood. So what's up with that? A gold ring is found at the scene. That seems to have some significance because in each case at the murder scene, there is no money that's taken from either victim. So the motive does not appear to be robbery. The murderer is caught, and his name is Jefferson Hope, also an American, working as a cab driver in London. He is arrested at 221B, and he wants to tell his story, which is really rather odd. If you are a suspect of a crime, you're not going to be telling the police what you did and how you did it and why you did it, because this will be held against you in a court of law. But he wants to tell his story, and that's a big question mark. What's the motive behind that? So that finishes up part 1, and we had a start on part 2. John Ferrier and a young baby girl, Lucy, are found dying on the Oregon Trail. They are the only two survivors of a party of 26, leaving the East, trying to find something in the West. They are saved by a religious group called the Mormons on their migration to find their promised land. They are given a choice. They can perish, or they can join the group and their religion. Not too much option here. So they join the group. John Ferrier is rewarded for his hunting and trailblazing skills as a guide with rich, fertile farmland once the religious group ends up in Salt Lake City in Utah, which they claim as their own. Time goes by. He builds a simple cabin, but through the years, the cabin has turned into a huge villa ranch. He adopts the girl Lucy, and she grows up to be a beautiful woman. She is out one day riding her horse, gets caught in a cattle stampede. She's saved by an observer, Jefferson Hope, our murderer, and things go pretty well between the two of them. He wants to marry her. John Ferrier, Lucy's adopted father, is okay with the plan because Jefferson Hope is not a Mormon and does not believe in polygamy or having many wives. So John Ferrier is okay with this. Jefferson Hope gets the okay. He leaves Lucy, and he has some silver mines a few days' ride away to make some money and then come back, get Lucy. They'll go off and get married. So we have means and we have opportunity, but we're still trying to hunt down the motive in this crime. What is the motive all about? So I think we left off at that point last week. So it's been 3 weeks since Jefferson Hope and his comrades departed from Salt Lake City. And he had always determined, deep down in his resolute heart, that nothing would ever induce him to allow his daughter to wed a Mormon, says John Ferrier. The situation is about to change, but we need to introduce the next character in our story, and that is of the Mormon leader, Brigham Young. So let's talk about Brigham Young for a minute. He's a real person, a real historic figure. And after the assassination of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young becomes the new leader of the Latter-day Saints, or Mormons. And he is the leader of the original group from Illinois to Salt Lake City, Utah, which at the time was part of Mexico. So Brigham Young's expedition was one of the largest and one of the best organized westward treks of any other group. He had sent his scouts out. They knew the trail very well by the time the group started. They had even planted corn along the way. So they were pretty good set up in terms of being able to survive the long trek from Illinois out to Utah. He had 55 wives, busy fellow, and he had many nicknames, among the most popular being American Moses. Some of his followers called him the Lion of the Lord, but he was most commonly called Brother Brigham. He supported slavery and its expansion into the Utah Territory once Utah became part of the United States. And through his efforts tried to legalize and regulate slavery. In terms of the church, he instituted a ban prohibiting the priesthood on men of Black African descent. That racial restriction remained in place in the Mormon Church until 1978, when the policy was finally rescinded. He organized a board of regents to establish a university in the Salt Lake Valley, which is even there present today. He led the church during called the Utah War against the United States. Didn't get very far and did not win that battle. He had 56 children by 16 of his wives, and 46 of those children reached adulthood. In 1902, 25 years after his death, the New York Times established that Young's direct descendants numbered more than 1,000. And some of those descendants have become leaders in what's called the LDS, Latter-day Saints Church. During the 30 years between the Mormons' arrival in Utah in 1847 and his death in 1877, Young directed the founding of 350 towns in the Southwest. So thereby the Mormons became the most important single agency in colonizing the vast arid West between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. Arthur Conan Doyle based his first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, on Mormon history, mentioning Young by name. When asked to comment on the story, which had provoked the animosity of the Mormon faithful, Doyle noted, quote, "All I said about the Dante band and the murders is historical, so I cannot withdraw that, though it is likely that in a work of fiction it is stated more luridly than in a work of history." Doyle's daughter later said, quote, "You know, Father would be the first to admit that his first Sherlock Holmes novel was full of errors about the Mormons." Okay, so interesting to note that many detective fiction stories intertwine real historic events. Poe with the real story of the murder of Mary Rogers, and Doyle with the Mormons. Agatha Christie, our next reading, intertwines the real historic crime called the Lindbergh kidnapping, and we'll get into that a little later. So the next few slides will set the stage for the next few chapters, which was this past week's reading assignment. So take a listen to the next few slides, and we'll pick it up on the other side. One fine morning, John Ferrier was about to set out to his wheat fields when he heard the click of the latch, and looking through the window, saw a stout, sandy-haired, middle-aged man coming up the pathway. His heart leapt to his mouth, for this was none other than the great Brigham Young himself. "Brother Ferrier," he said, taking a seat and eyeing the farmer keenly from his light-colored eyelashes. "True believers have been good friends to you. We picked you up when you were starving in the desert. We shared our food with you, led you safe to the chosen valley, gave you a goodly share of land, and allowed you to wax rich under our protection. Is that not so?" "It is so," answered Ferrier. "In return, all that we asked but one condition, that was, that you should embrace the true faith, and conform in every way to its usages. This you promised to do, and this, if common report says truly, you have neglected." "And how have I neglected it?" asked Ferrier. "Where are your wives?" asked Young, looking round him. "Call them in, that I may greet them." "It is true that I have not married," Ferrier answered, "but women are few, and there were many who had better claims than I. I was not a lonely man. I had my daughter to attend my wants." "It is of that daughter that I would speak to you," said the leader of the Mormons. "She has grown to be the flower of Utah, and has found favor in the eyes of many who are high in the land." John Ferrier groaned internally. "There are stories of her which I fain disbelieve, stories that she is sealed to some Gentile. This must be the gossip of idle tongues. What is the 13th rule of the code of the sainted Joseph Smith? Let every maiden of the true faith marry one of the elect, for if she wed a Gentile, she commits a grievous sin. This being so, it is impossible that you, who profess the Holy Creed, should suffer your daughter to violate it. Upon this one point, your whole faith shall be tested. So it has been decided in the Sacred Council of Four. The girl is young, and we would not have her wed gray hairs. Neither would we deprive her of all choice. Stangerson has a son, and Drebber has a son, and either of them would gladly welcome your daughter to their house. Let her choose between them. They are young and rich, and of the true faith. What say you to that?" Ferrier remained silent for some time, and his brows knitted. "You will give us time," he said at last. "My daughter is very young, and she is scarce of any age to marry." "She shall have a month to choose," said Young, rising from his seat. "At the end of that time, she shall give her answer." Brigham Young leaves. Daughter Lucy has overheard their conversation and no part of this option. She wants a life with Jefferson Hope. On the morning which followed his interview with the Mormon prophet, John Ferrier went into Salt Lake City, found his acquaintance, who was bound for the Nevada mountains. He entrusted him with his message to Jefferson Hope. In it, he told the young man of the imminent danger which threatened them, and how necessary it was that he should return. Having done this, he felt easier in his mind, and returned home with a lighter heart. As he approached his farm, he was surprised to see a horse hitched to each of the posts of the gate. Still more surprised was he on entering to find two young men in possession of his sitting room. One, with a long pale face, was leaning back in a rocking chair, with his feet cocked up upon the stove. The other, a bull-necked youth with coarse, bloated features, was standing in front of the window with his hands in his pockets, whistling a popular hymn. Both of them nodded to Ferrier as he entered, and the one in the rocking chair commenced the conversation. "Maybe you don't know us," he said. "This here is the son of Elder Drebber, and I'm Joseph Stangerson, who traveled with you in the desert when the Lord stretched out his hand and gathered you into the true fold. We have come," continued Stangerson, "at the advice of our fathers, to solicit the hand of your daughter for whichever of us may seem good to you and to her. As I have but 4 wives, and Brother Drebber here has 7, it appears to me that my claim is the stronger one." During this dialogue, John Ferrier stood fuming in the doorway, hardly able to keep his riding whip from the backs of the 2 visitors. "Look here," he said at last, striding up to them. "When my daughter summons you, you can come. But until then, I don't want to see your faces again." The 2 young Mormons stared at him in amazement. In their eyes, this competition between them for the maiden hand was the highest of honors, both for her and to her father. "There are 2 ways out of this room," cried Ferrier. "There is the door, and there is the window. Which do you care to use?" His brown face looked so savage, and his gaunt hands so threatening, that his visitors sprang to their feet and beat a hurried retreat. The old farmer followed them to the door. "Let me know when you have settled which it is to be," he said sardonically. In the whole history of the settlement, there had never been such a case of rank disobedience to the authority of the elders. If minor errors were punished so sternly, what would be his face? "You shall smart for this," Stangerson cried, white with rage. "You have defied the prophet and the council of 4. You shall rue it to the end of your days." He expected that he would receive some message from Young as to his conduct, and he was not mistaken, though it came in an unlooked-for manner. Upon rising next morning, he found, to his surprise, a small square of paper pinned to the cover of his bed, just over his chest. On it was printed in bold, staggering letters, "29 days are given you for amendment, and then—" Thus day followed day, and as sure as morning came, he found that his unseen enemies had kept their register, and had marked up in some conspicuous position how many days were still left to him out of the month of grace. Sometimes the fatal numbers appeared upon the walls, sometimes upon the floors. Occasionally there were on small placards stuck upon the garden gate or the railings. 20 had changed to 15 and 15 to 10, but there was no news of the absentee. One by one, the numbers dwindled down. Still, there came no sign of him. Whenever a horseman clambered down the road or a driver shouted at his team, the old farmer hurried to the gate, thinking that help had arrived at last. At last, when he saw 5 give way to 4, and that again to 3, he lost heart and abandoned all hope of escape. Single-handed, with his limited knowledge of the mountains which surrounded the settlement, he knew that he was powerless. The more frequented roads were strictly watched and guarded, and none could pass among them without an order from the council. Turn which way he would, there appeared to be no avail the blow which hung over him. Yet the old man never wavered in his resolution to part with life itself before he consented to what he regarded as his daughter's dishonor. That morning had shown the figure, too, upon the wall of his house, and the next day would be the last of the allotted time. What was that? In the silence he heard a gentle scratching sound, low but very distinct in the quiet of the night. It came from the door of the house. With a sigh of relief, Ferrier looked down to the right and to the left, until happening to glance straight down at his own feet, he saw, to his astonishment, Jefferson Hope, lying flat upon his face upon the ground, with arms and legs all asprawl. Okay, so quick review. Jefferson Hope leaves. He's going to make some money at his mine. The next day, Brigham Young visits John Ferrier, tells him he's got to think about his daughter marrying one of 2 of the young men in the community. John's not happy about this at all. He goes into town, finds someone going out to the mines of Jefferson Hope and give him the message that things are not well back in Salt Lake City, and he needs to come and help John and Lucy escape. Days go by, messages are left. It's down to the final day. Jefferson Hope has not arrived yet. He basically finally gets there in the final 11th hour, late at night, and basically that's where we are now. So Jefferson Hope, John Ferrier, Lucy, they pack up their belongings. Jefferson has a few horses a couple miles away. They have to leave out one of the side windows of the villa. Their house is being watched closely. They run through the fields and they do seem to get away. So they are headed to a place called Carson City in Nevada, and that's on the furthest western side of Nevada on the border of California. And by today's travel through highways and such, there's about 700 miles. It would probably be much longer back in those days, through valleys and passes, around mountains, over mountains, you name it. It's a long haul. It could take several weeks traveling on horse and foot to make it that far away to Carson City, which they think, and probably is true, that if they make it there, they will be safe. Okay, so they've made it out of the house. They've run across the field. They seem to be safe. They meet up with the horses that Jefferson has left as their getaway, and they're on their way through the mountain passes. The roads are guarded. They almost get caught on several occasions. Just by chance, they find out what the password is. If they do get questioned, they do have to use that at one particular point. They really didn't pack very well in terms of food. That's a question mark for me. Why didn't they do that? That would seem like an important thing to have on hand. Like, it's going to take a couple weeks to get out to Carson City. Why didn't you bring some food or enough food with you? So, nevertheless, it's a fiction story. And the story goes on to say at about the middle of the second day, their provisions begin to run out. Now, Jefferson Hope is a hunter, so he's not too uneasy about that. And he finds a sheltered, it's called a nook. It's just kind of a safe place between the rocks that you could kind of build a shelter. And he piles together some branches and makes a big fire. And he leaves John Ferrier and Lucy there while he goes out to hunt. Now, they are about 5,000 feet above sea level in the Rocky Mountains. And it is severely cold there at night. If you ever have a chance to see the Rocky Mountains, 5,000 feet is quite a height. The air is very thin. It's somewhat hard to breathe there. So, nevertheless, Jefferson Hope leaves John and Lucy to kind of warm themselves up while he goes out and hunts some food. And the story goes into great detail about this hunting trip. He's not finding any game quickly. He has to travel several miles to find something. He finds a big horned sheep, which he kills. He can't bring the whole thing back, but he cuts off a big piece and carries it back to the nook where he left John and Lucy. Gets a little lost along the way. It's getting dark, cold. It takes a long time for him to get back to the campsite. He finally makes it there. And it says from the story, when he turned the corner, he came full in sight of the spot where the fire had been lit. There was still a glowing pile of wood ashes there, but it had evidently not been tended since he departed. The same dead silence still reigned all around. With his fears all changed to convictions, he hurried on. There was no living creature near the remains of the fire. Animals, man, maiden, all were gone. It was only too clear that some sudden and terrible disaster had occurred during his absence, a disaster which had embraced them all and yet left no traces behind it. The ground was all stamped down by the feet of horses, showing that a large party of mounted men had overtaken the fugitives, and the direction of their tracks proved that they had afterwards turned back to Salt Lake City. Had they carried back both of his companions with them? Jefferson Hope had almost persuaded himself that they must have done so, when his eyes fell upon an object which made every nerve of his body tingle within him. A little way on one side of the camp was a low-lying heap of reddish soil, which had assuredly not been there before. There was no mistaking it for anything but a newly dug grave. As the young hunter approached it, he perceived that a stick had been planted on it, with a sheet of paper stuck in the cleft fork of it. The inscription upon the paper was brief but to the point. John Ferrier, formerly of Salt Lake City 22, died August 4th, 1860. Okay, so now we know that John Ferrier was killed, but there's no sign of Lucy, the horses, or anything else. Jefferson Hope returns to Salt Lake City, and he runs into a man that he knows, a Mormon named Cowper, and they had done business together before. And Cowper has informed Jefferson Hope that Lucy had been married off to young Drebber, and that Stangerson was the one who shot her father. Lucy dies within a month. Jefferson Hope hears about this. Now, in the Mormon tradition, when one of the wives of the family dies, the women in their own private shelter or setting stay up at night with the body of the deceased wife. Jefferson Hope finds this shelter, rushes in to the astonishment of the women who are there. There are no guards, there are no men there. They recognize him. He goes to the body of Lucy, takes the ring from her finger, and kisses her goodbye on the forehead. He leaves. The word goes around the community that Jefferson Hope came back, took the ring. Now Drebber and Stangerson become a little worried. This guy is pretty brave, and he seems to have revenge in his mind. As time goes by, Jefferson Hope tries to kill both Drebber and Stangerson, but he's unsuccessful. One attempt was to roll a large boulder down a mountain onto the path where one of the men was riding by on his horse. He gets thrown for the horse, but he doesn't get crushed by the boulder. Another attempt, Jefferson Hope shoots through the window of one of the two guys' house and misses. Jefferson Hope goes back to the mines. He's pretty worn out. He needs to make some money. He's going to kill these two guys if it takes the rest of his life to do so. And he actually doesn't even care what happens to himself. He does recuperate his health, and he puts some money together to fulfill his revenge. So as time goes by, within the church, within the Mormon church, there is like it's called a schism, but it's a separation. Some of the younger Mormons rebel against the elders. We don't really know the details of it, but many leave the church, leave Salt Lake City, and become Christian. And both Drebber and Stangerson are part of those younger members that rebelled against the authority and left. So nobody's sure where they had gone. So Jefferson is traveling, trying to hunt these two guys down. Years passed. His black hair is turning gray, but he still wanders on like a human bloodhound. And he eventually makes it to a city called Cleveland in Ohio. And he really looks like a beggar at this point, or a vagrant. And he looks through the window of a shop, and he recognizes Drebber. And Drebber looks out the window and recognizes Jefferson Hope. And so he is actually kind of arrested. He's kept in jail for a couple of weeks. He's finally let go. I mean, he didn't try to do anything at that particular point. So the arrest was basically just as being what's called a vagrant. And so, he's let go. But he finds out that both Drebber and Stangerson have left Cincinnati, and he has to continue on his journey. But he does find out that both of them have left for Europe. So the story now, the setting has changed. We're now in Europe. Stangerson and Drebber are on the run. They absolutely know that Jefferson has not given up his revenge, even though it's been many years. They reach St. Petersburg. Jefferson Hope is on the trail, but he arrives too late. he finds out that they have left St. Petersburg and gone to Paris. So he follows them there, where he finds out they have just left for Copenhagen. He goes to Copenhagen. He finds out that they have left Copenhagen and have journeyed on to London. And from here, we know the rest of the story because Jefferson Hope does finally get his revenge, but he is shortly thereafter arrested at 221B and taken to the police station. The prisoner will be put before the magistrates in the course of the week. In the meantime, Jefferson Hope, have you anything that you wish to say? I must warn you that your words will be taken down and may be used against you. So here we are. The prisoner says slowly, I've got a good deal to say. I want to tell you gentlemen all about it. And they say, well, maybe you better reserve that for your trial. And Jefferson Hope says, I may never be tried. You needn't look startled. It isn't suicide I'm thinking of. And he looks at Watson and he says, are you a doctor? He turned his fierce dark eyes upon me as he asked this last question. Yes, I am, I answered, says Watson. Then put your hand here, he said with a smile, motioning with his manacled wrist toward his chest. I did so, says Watson, and became at once conscious of an extraordinary throbbing and commotion which was going on inside. The walls of his chest seemed to thrill and quiver as a frail building would do inside when some powerful engine was at work. In that silence of the room, I could hear a dull humming and buzzing noise which proceeded from the same source. Why, I cried, you have an aortic aneurysm. That's what they call it, he said placidly. I went to a doctor last week about it, and he told me it was bound to burst before many days passed. It's been getting worse for the years. I got it from overexposure and underfeeding among the Salt Lake Mountains. I've done my work now, and I don't care how soon I go, but I should like to leave some account of this business behind me. I don't want to be remembered as a common cutthroat. The inspector and the two detectives had a hurried discussion as to the advisability of allowing him to tell his story, which he does. So let's tie up some of the loose end to the story. The pills that were found at the scene, one was poisonous, one was not. So at the first murder scene, he gave his victim the option of taking one of the pills, and he would take the other. Now, depending on who got which pill, that would kind of end the story. Unfortunately for the victim, he chose the poison pill and died instantly. Sherlock recognizes that the murder was done by poison when he smelled it on the victim's lips. The written word R-A-C-H-E, the police thought was the unfinished spelling of a woman's name of Rachel, as Sherlock Holmes deduced was incorrect, and was the German word Achi, which means revenge. Now, the first victim had no bloody wound. Where did the blood come from? Well, the blood came from the nose of Jefferson Hope, whose aortic aneurysm had caused a severe nosebleed, and he used his own blood to write Achi on the walls. He thought maybe this would throw the police off a little bit. We call that the red herring. But it didn't fool our man, Sherlock Holmes. The ring on the body, that was the ring that was on Lucy's body after she was forced to marry one of the Mormons against her will. She dies a month later. Okay, so that kind of ties up our story, a study in Scarlet, and we will move on to an introduction to our next author, Dame Agatha Mary Clarissa Christie. Okay, we'll move on from here. Okay, so let's introduce our next author, Dame Agatha Mary Clarissa Christie, who writes our next story, The Murder on the Orient Express. So, Christie wrote 75 novels, 66 detective novels, 14 short stories. She's perhaps the world's most famous mystery writer and one of the best-selling novelists of all time. Her works are reportedly outsold only by Shakespeare and the Bible. She has kind of her own mystery in her own personal life. And in 1926, Agatha Christie disappears for 11 days. The famed murder mystery writer was in the midst of a divorce from her first husband, Archie Christie, and she was dealing with the aftermath of the death of her mother. December 3rd, she left her home, and the next morning her car was found abandoned nearby. She eventually returns, doesn't say much, can't really remember where she was. It's never quite been figured out. So, mystery writer has her own mystery. She creates a detective character, Hercule Poirot, and he is from Belgium, the country of Belgium. And he was a police commissioner who turns detective. So Poirot is one of Christie's most famous long-running characters. He appears in 33 of her detective novels, a couple of plays. She also wrote a couple of plays. and about 50 of those short stories that were published between 1920 and 1975. So we have Poe, we have Doyle. Now, Christie is our most contemporary author of the three. And the language in her text is very much modern, much easier read than both Poe and Doyle. Very much contemporary in her writing style. Poe has some description. Doyle goes into great length of description. Christie goes even further from a more feminine approach. And we'll see the differences as we read on. So her main character, Hercule Poirot, has been portrayed on radio, film, television by various actors. Poirot's name was derived from two other fictional detectives of the time. A detective named Hercule Pompeo and Frank Howell Evans, Monsieur Poirot, who was a real retired Belgian police officer who was living in London. The more obvious influence on early Poirot stories is that of Arthur Conan Doyle. In Christie's autobiography states, "I was still writing in the Sherlock Holmes tradition, eccentric detective, stooge assistant, with a Lestrade-type Scotland Yard detective, Inspector Zapp." For his part, Conan Doyle acknowledged basing his detective stories on the model of Edgar Allan Poe's C. Augustin Dupin and his anonymous narrator, and based his Sherlock Holmes on Joseph Bell, who, in the use of logic, prefigured Poirot's reliance on his little gray cells. And we hear Poirot speaking about his little gray cells just as a reference back to both Sherlock Holmes and Dupin's logic and deduction. Poirot first appeared in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920, and exited in Curtain, published in 1975. So we've got about 50 years worth of Hercule Poirot. Following the latter, Poirot is the only fictional character to receive an obituary on the front page of the New York Times. By 1930, Agatha Christie found Poirot insufferable. And by 1960, she felt that he was a detestable, bombastic, tiresome, egocentric little creep. Yet the public loved him. And Christie refused to kill him off, claiming that it was her duty to produce what the public liked. So here again, two authors want to kill off their main character. They're tired of writing about the subject, but the public says, no, we want more. Captain Arthur Hastings' first description of Poirot. He says he was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His mustache was very stiff and military. Even if everything on his face was covered up, the tips of his mustache and his little pink-tipped nose would be visible. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Yet this quaint, dignified little man, who I was sorry to see now limped badly, had been in his time one of the most celebrated members of the Belgian police. Poirot is extremely punctual. He carries a pocket watch almost to the end of his career. He was also particular about his personal finances, preferring to keep a bank balance of 444 pounds, 4 shillings, and 4 pence. One of the more famous actors who played Poirot, David Chaussee, who played Poirot on television, said, "There is no question he's obsessive-compulsive." He enjoyed finding the sort of obsessive-compulsiveness in Poirot. He mentioned in Curtin and the Clocks, he was fond of classical music, particularly Mozart and Bach. Poirot's investigative techniques assist him in solving cases. For in the long run, either through a lie or through truth, people were bound to give themselves away. At the end, Poirot usually reveals his description of the sequence of events and his deductions to a room of suspects, often leading to the culprit's apprehension. Between the world wars, Poirot traveled all over Europe, Africa, Asia, and half of South America, investigating crimes and solving murders. So that's a little bit about Agatha Christie and her writing of her main character, Hercule Poirot. Now, she comes up with the idea for him because during World War I, there were a lot of refugees from Belgium who had escaped Europe and gone to Europe. And in her little town, there were several, I guess you'd call it like a refugee camp for these Belgians. And it was encouraged by the English to become friendly with them, which she did in her home little town. And this is how she comes up with the idea of a Belgian detective. So that's a little bit about Agatha Christie, and we will move on to the next slide, which kind of sets the background in our story, The Orient Express, although under a different name called the Daisy Armstrong murders. It's a direct reference to a real crime, kidnapping of a young child, 20 months old, of the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh. True story, happened in New Jersey. Again, just like Poe, relating back to a real-life crime in New York City of Marie Rogers. Again, going back to Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, his true historic events of the Mormon exodus from Illinois to Salt Lake City, intertwining these real-life events into a fiction story. Okay, so we'll move on to our next slide from here. The Lindbergh kidnapping. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., 20-month-old son of the famous aviator, and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was kidnapped about 9 p.m. on March 1st, 1932, from the nursery on the second floor of the Lindbergh home near Hopewell, New Jersey. The child's absence was discovered and reported to his parents, who were then at home, at approximately 10 p.m. by the child's nurse, Betty Gow. A search of the premises was immediately made, and a ransom note demanding $50,000 was found on the nursery window sill. After the Hopewell police were notified, the report was telephoned to the New Jersey State Police, who assumed charge of the investigation. Son of Charles Lindbergh. During the search at the kidnapping scene, traces of mud were found on the floor of the nursery. Footprints, impossible to measure, were found under the nursery window. 2 sections of the ladder had been used in reaching the window. One of the 2 sections was split or broken where it joined the other, indicating that the ladder had broken during the ascent or descent. There were no bloodstains in or about the nursery, nor were there any fingerprints. Household and estate employees were questioned and investigated. Colonel Lindbergh asked friends to communicate with the kidnappers, and they made widespread appeals to the kidnappers to start negotiations. Various underworld characters were dealt with in attempts to contact the kidnappers, and numerous clues were advanced and exhausted. After several months, ransom notes were exchanged. After some investigating, an arrest was made, and he was found to be Bruno Richard Hopman, the individual to whom the automobile license had been issued, a German carpenter who had been in the country for approximately 11 years. A $20 gold ransom certificate was found on his person. His description fit perfectly of that of John as described by Dr. Condon, who was the contact between Lindbergh and the kidnappers. And in his house was found a pair of shoes which had been purchased with a $20 ransom bill recovered on September 8, 1934. Hopton admitted several other purchases which had been made with ransom certificates. On the night of September 19, 1934, he was positively identified by Joseph Perrone as the individual from whom he had received the 5th ransom note to be delivered to Dr. Condon. The following day, ransom certificates in excess of $13,000 were found secreted away in the garage of Hopman's residence. Shortly thereafter, he was identified by Dr. Condon as John, to whom the ransom had been paid. It was also ascertained that he was in possession of a Dodge sedan automobile, which answered the description of that seen in the vicinity of the Lindbergh home the day prior to the kidnapping. The trial of Hopman began on January 3, 1935, in Flemington, New Jersey, and lasted 5 weeks. The case against him was based on circumstantial evidence. Tool marks on the ladder matched the tools owned by Hopman. Wood in the ladder was found to match wood used as flooring in his attic. Dr. Condon's telephone number and address were found scrawled on a door frame inside a closet. Handwriting on the ransom notes matched samples of Hopman's handwriting. On February 13, 1935, the jury returned a verdict. Hopman was guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, death. On April 3, 1936, at 8:47 p.m., Richard Hopman was electrocuted. Let's take a look at a video about the Lindbergh kidnapping and murder. Okay, so let's get a very brief beginning start to our next story called The Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. So our hero, Hercule Poirot, starts off in Syria. And he has just solved a military crime, which would have been an embarrassment to France and to the military. We don't get a lot of details about that particular crime or situation which he helps to resolve. But nevertheless, that has concluded, and he is now leaving Syria and is going to Istanbul to spend a few days relaxing and then head back to London via the Orient Express. So he gets to the station or port, and he's on his way to the hotel. And he notices a British couple having a discussion. And he overhears the woman say something like, "Not now, we must wait until all this business is done." Okay, whatever. Kind of foreshadowing, but we have no details to go on at this point. So he arrives at the hotel, and he's booking his room, and there is a message for him that he must immediately go back to London. There is a train leaving that night, but it seems to be full, which is kind of odd. It's never really full, and this is not the main tourist season. Nevertheless, long story short, through a mutual friend that he meets at the hotel, has some power, on this train and finds a way to get Poirot a room or a cabin on that train that night, which he does. While he's in the hotel, he notices an American businessman talking to another man, having a discussion. And, he's very quick to determine these are Americans, and he's kind of making some assumptions about his character and personality and so forth. Again, foreshadowing what's going to happen later in our story. So there are three options to take a look at for our new story. If you can find the 1974 movie version of Murder on the Orient Express, that pretty much follows Agatha Christie's story in detail. It's probably the better movie of all the movies that have been made in terms of following the exact storyline. You may be able to find that on some kind of a movie YouTube network. And that movie also features many of the well-known movie stars of the 70s. You will recognize a lot of the names who played characters in that movie. And of all of them, again, it's probably the better movie version to view. There is also an audio book and the reading. So you might want to touch base with all three of those options for getting the story under your belt, so you can understand our further discussions coming up next week. So at this point, we're going to take a left turn, and we're going to talk about a detective drama series called Foley's War. It's a series that is set in Hastings in Sussex, England, during World War II. Very much military detective stories. And this was created right after the conclusion of the Inspector Morse detective series that we talked about last week. So let's take a look at that. It's called Foley's War. And in the next slide, we'll go into more detail about that. Foley's War. Foley's War is a British detective drama television series set during the Second World War. The TV series replaced the long-running series Inspector Morse, which ended in the year 2000. Set during the Second World War in Hastings, Sussex, England. Detective Chief Superintendent Christopher Foley, played by Michael Kitchen, a widower, is quiet, methodical, sagacious, scrupulously honest, and frequently underestimated by his foes. Many of his cases concern profiteering, the black market, and murder. He is often called on to catch criminals who are taking advantage of the confusion created by the war. Although Foley often comes up against high-ranking officials in the British military or intelligence services who would prefer that he mind his own business, He seeks justice tenaciously throughout the series. He is assisted by his driver, Samantha Sam Stewart, played by Honeysuckle Weeks, and Detective Sergeant Paul Milner, Anthony Howell. The stories are largely self-contained. There are some running plot strands, primarily involving the career of Foley's son, Andrew Foley, a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force, or Foley's relationships with minor characters. The episode runs for 90 to 100 minutes, filling a 2-hour time slot on TV when commercials are included. Detective Chief Superintendent Foley introduces himself with the phrase, or some variation thereof, quote, "My name's Foley. I'm a police officer." Typical of the modesty, courtesy, and precision of speech he exhibits throughout the series. Foley is a widower of long standing. He has one son, Andrew, with whom he is close. Foley's concern for Andrew's safety as a fighter pilot in the RAF is a recurring theme. His wife, Rosalind, died in 1932. According to her tombstone, she was 29 years old. Foley is the son of a policeman, a World War I veteran who fought in Belgium. He once told Andrew that his 3 years of military service were the worst years of his life and reluctantly admitted killing enemy soldiers. He relaxes by trout fishing, at which he is very skilled, and which supplements his wartime rations. He plays golf with less proficiency. The series is noted for its attention to historic detail and the drama of frequently moved along by historical events of the Second World War. As the series progressed, the murder mystery format replaced the portrayal of history. Let's take a look at a video from the series Foley's War. Okay, our mystery song of the week is Kid Charlemagne by Steely Dan. And this is from an article from sfist.com entitled Kid Charlemagne, a close reading of Steely Dan's ode to Haight Street's LSD King. "Oh, Osley, can you hear me now?" Jimi Hendrix says on a BBC Sessions recording of Day Tripper just before he starts his solo. It's an appropriate reference and one of very many in popular American music from the 60s and 70s to Osley Stanley. Rolling Stone called him the King of Acid, as he reportedly referred to himself when he was arrested with the Grateful Dead. Dennis McNally, a biographer of the band, wrote that without Stanley, there simply wouldn't have been enough acid for the psychedelic scene of the Bay Area in the 60s to have ignited. By his account, between the years 1965 and 67, Stanley produced over 1 million doses of acid as his formula became the industry standard. Stanley, born Augustus Oswell Stanley III in 1935, was known to nearly all of his friends and customers as Bear. In a single released by Steely Dan from the 1976 album The Royal Scam, Stanley has another name, Kid Charlemagne. a reference to the first Holy Roman Emperor and father of Europe. The song looks at the rise and fall of the local legend who literally influenced San Francisco and American music. From the song lyrics, while the music played, you worked by candlelight. Those San Franciscan nights, you were the best in town. Steely Dan's Walter Becker and Donald Fagen have made explicit their song's allusion to Stanley, who was certainly regarded as the best in town when he began producing LSD in the Bay Area. Nicknamed for his hairiness from a young age, according to his obituary in the New York Times, Stanley was born to a patrician Kentucky family. He was expelled from a military preparatory school in Maryland for furnishing alcohol to his fellow students. Later, he served in the Air Force and then entered ballet as a professional dancer. From the song, just by chance you crossed the diamond with the pearl. You turned it on the world. That's when you turned the world around. White Lightning, Monterey Purple, Blue Cheer. Those were a few of the varieties of acid Stanley produced, though not as rumored Purple Haze. Once he encountered the stuff for the first time in Berkeley. After weeks spent studying his craft through books at the university library, Stanley started his own production at a small lab located in the bathroom of a house near campus. He soon dropped out of school for another calling, the Beer Research Group, as he sometimes referred to his endeavors. From the song, do you feel like Jesus? Do you realize that you are a champion in their eyes? Though Steely Dan, Stanley has even changed the work of Kanye West. Fans of that artist will recognize this section of Kid Charlemagne from West's sample of it on Champion off the 2007 album Graduation. From the song, oh, on the hill the stuff was laced with kerosene, but yours was kitchen clean. Everyone stopped to stare at your Technicolor motorhome. Every A-frame had your number on the wall. You must have had it all. You'd go to LA on a dare. You'd go it alone. Stanley told the San Francisco Chronicle in 2007 that he was just making a product that he knew well and could consume himself. And my friends all wanted to know what they were taking too, he said. Added that my friends expanded very rapidly. Soon Stanley was involved with the Merry Pranksters, a cohort of Ken Kesey, who may be referenced with that Technicolor motorhome aside. Stanley met Kesey in 1965, and his bad trip with the writer is immortalized in Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Through Kesey, Stanley formed a lifelong relationship with the members of the Grateful Dead. He would be known as a pioneering sound man, but first served as a manager and financial backer, and sometimes as a housemate. No doubt an important role of Stanley's was keeping the band in good supply. When he was referred to as an LSD millionaire in a newspaper headline, the Dead composed their own anthem for him, Alice D. Millionaire. With Bob Thomas, Stanley, who also worked as an artist, designed the Grateful Dead's skull and lightning bolt logo, known to fans as Steely, before the term taper came into use. Stanley was recording the band's performances. Stanley's influence could be seen everywhere. In Bob Thomas' other popular Dead symbol, the dancing bears, for example, Stanley, however, described them as marching rather than dancing. From the song, could you live forever? Could you see the day? Could you feel your whole world fall apart and fade away? Get along, Kid Charlemagne. Get along, Kid Charlemagne. According to a biography by Bob Spitz, John Lennon contacted a lifetime supply of acid from Stanley. But according to Rolling Stone, the man and his habits could not reign forever. He soon parted ways with the Dead, anecdotally, over a dietary disagreement. Purportedly, Stanley insisted that the band adhere to his diet, which we would today refer to as strictly paleo. Stanley simply did not believe in eating plants and would credit his carnivorous streak with his renewed health after a bout of throat cancer. The record should show he also received radiation therapy. From the song, now your patrons have left you in the red. Your low rent friends are dead. This life can be very strange. And all those Dago freaks who used to paint the face, they joined the human race. Some things will never change. Son, you were mistaken. You are obsolete. Look at all the white men on the street. Acid became illegal in 1966, and in late 1967, Stanley's lab was raided by the police. Though he claimed the thousands of doses discovered there were for his personal use, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Stanley's incarceration was bemoaned by Hunter Thompson's in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, cast as a death nail for the 60s. Get along, Kid Charlemagne. Get along, Kid Charlemagne. Clean this mess up, else we'll all end up in jail. Those test tubes and the scales, just get them all out of here. Released from prison, Stanley returned to work sound with the Grateful Dead. He was present at the famous New Orleans bust recalled in a song Truckin', during which 19 band and crew members were arrested for possession of a variety of narcotics at their French Quarter Hotel. According to an article in the State Times of Baton Rouge, Stanley identified himself to the police as the King of Acid and a band technician. A 1970s judge revoked Stanley's bail from a drug arrest in 1967. He served 2 years in federal prison. Is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car. I think the people down the hall who know who you are. Stanley emigrated to Australia in 1990, and there in 2011, his car swerved off a highway and down an embankment, hitting a tree near a town in Queensland, according to Associated Press. Stanley's wife was involved in the crash but survived. Careful what you carry, because the man is wise. You are still an outlaw in their eyes. Get along, Kid Charlemagne. Get along, Kid Charlemagne. Most recently, according to the Oswald Stanley Foundation, which is made up of friends and family, at the Fare Thee Well concert in Chicago, the Grateful Dead said a final goodbye to Bear. Stanley's ashes were displayed on the soundboard where he so often worked. This song was inspired by Oswald Stanley III, the first underground chemist to mass produce high-quality LSD in the 60s in San Francisco. Walter Becker explained, it's a kind of Oswald-esque figure that existed in our minds. I think he was based on the idea of the outlaw acid chef of the 60s who had essentially outlived the social context of his specialty, but of course, he's still an outlaw. According to Donald Fagen, the story in this song takes place from 1968 to 1976. As time goes on, Charlemagne's service falls out of favor, leading to his demise. Steely Dan favorite Larry Carlton played guitar on this track. Donald Fagen said, he's a real virtuoso. In my opinion, he can get around his instrument better than any solo guitarist. He is also quite a good blues player. He did the solos on Kid Charlemagne. The middle solo he did in 2 takes, and we used parts of both. The last solo was straight improvisation. In a Rolling Stone interview before the Steely Dan 2009 tour, Becker said that this was one of their most requested songs, with the line, is there gas in the car? Yes, there's gas in the car. Providing a sing-along moment, said Becker. A cab driver once told me that that was the stupidest line he's ever heard. Okay, so let's listen to our mystery song of the week, Kid Charlemagne by Steely Dan. Okay, so let's finish up our week here. Let's do a quick wrap up of what we talked about today. So we started off by introducing some of the historic materials and the next character entering into our story, Brigham Young. We pretty much finished up the second half of the story, A Study in Scarlet, answered all the questions and had a final wrap up of that story with all the clues and materials that were found at the scene and why they are significant. Next, we talked about and introduced the author of our next story, Agatha Christie. We introduced and started talking a little bit about Hercule Poirot, the main character in our next story, where he comes from, what his personality was based upon. And we gave a very brief introduction to the beginning of murder on the Orient Express. We took a left turn and introduced a detective series called Foley's War, which took the place of Inspector Morse when that finished its run of many years. That detective series, Foley's War, takes place in World War II and is kind of military detective influenced. Then we talked about our mystery song of the week, Kid Charlemagne, and its reference to a pretty bad guy who was a drug dealer who became popular during the hippie generation in the 60s, but at the end of the day really did a lot of damage to a lot of young people. So basically that's it for today. There are several connecting videos to this lesson, which will be sent to you via email and or can be found in the description box below. Okay, so that's it for this week. We'll see you next week. You have several choices for your next reading assignment. Could be movie, could be audiobook, could be reading, could be any combination of the above. And the details have been sent to you by email. Okay, so that's it. We'll see you again next week. Bye.